20 days to a month like Carol. How many women will potentially suffer like Carol? H.R. 8 also has other problems. Unfortunately, the debate in Judiciary Committee was cut short. Many common sense amendments were not even heard. Only 10 amendments out of 100 were heard before the chairman cut off debate. Because of the rush to get this bill through, there's another problem. There's vague language that is not defined and thus is open to interpretation. And so I know in some of the amendments, the majority party has tried to give an alternative to my good common sense domestic violence amendments, but it doesn't do any good. And this is the reason. It's because the language is so vague. It says, under H.R. 8, a person is allowed to temporarily transfer a firearm if it is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm. The question is, there's no definition of this. So how long is temporary transfer? Who determines that? Does the victim determine it? Who determines if there is imminent death? Does it qualify if a victim of domestic violence thinks they will be killed? Or does the person transferring the gun have to be in the same room and there be some kind of shootout and they throw a gun to them? What does imminent danger and imminent death mean? With something as important as the Second Amendment, I think we owe it to the American people to do our work and take as long as we have to in order to have a fair and open debate on major pieces of legislation. With that, I urge opposition to the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first thing I'd like to do is to submit for the record a statement by the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, which is in favor of this legislation and against any weakening amendments. And just to quote a small part of it, firearms pose a significant danger to victims of domestic violence, and this is true no matter who owns the firearm. Research shows that a male abuser's access to a firearm increases the risk of intimate partner femicide fivefold and does not support the contention that firearm possession is a protective factor for the victim. And so there's more in here of interest. But I'd like to
without objection.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my distinguished colleague from Arizona for her thoughts on the question of sexual and domestic violence. We indeed have a provision within the legislation which allows for an exemption from the background check requirement in cases of an imminent threat of great bodily harm. The question has been raised, does that include sexual assault, dating partner violence, stalking, and so on? We thought it was self-evident that it did, but in any event, Representatives Horn and from Oklahoma and Murphy from Florida are introducing a clarifying amendment to be very specific that it's included. So at that point, perhaps we could welcome the support of the distinguished gentlewoman from Arizona, because we're being very clear at that point that our exception for imminent bodily harm and violence includes sexual assault and so on. And I'm certain that your intentions are good, just as are the intentions of the authors of the amendment in the bill. But let me just address, in case you haven't decided to come over to our side now, address some of the general points that were made against the legislation. The gentlelady articulated an argument we've been hearing a lot of from our counterparts, which is that criminals don't follow the law, and therefore there's no reason to get rid of the loopholes and strengthen the law because criminals won't follow the law. Now, the fallacy of that argument is plain to see. It's an argument against all law. It's an argument against the law against murder because murderers obviously don't follow the law against murder. It's an argument against the law opposed to theft because thieves don't follow the law against theft. But I think anyone who takes time to really study what law is understands that the purpose of the law is to deter people from negative, socially harmful action. The way that the Brady Act has deterred more than 3 million people felons and fugitives and the mentally unstable and other unauthorized categories from accessing a weapon. Now, that argument sweeps so broadly that it's an argument against having the Brady Act that we have now, and perhaps that's the intention, simply to take down the law that we've got now. The other purpose of law, of course, is to punish people who violate it, and then again to send a moral message about what the social norms are. And we've got social norms about driving, for example. Would we say we're not going to have driver's licenses in America because people who drive without a driver's license ignore the law requiring you to have a driver's license? It's a completely nonsensical argument. Let's come back to reality and talk about what the Brady Act actually requires the gun dealers to ask people. Here are the basic questions that are being asked. Are you under indictment for, or have you ever been convicted of a felony? Are you a fugitive from justice? Are you an unlawful user of a controlled substance? Do you suffer from mental illness? Have you been dishonorably discharged from the armed forces? Are you subject to a court order restraining you from harassing, stalking, or threatening your child or an intimate partner? Have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence? Have you renounced your United States citizenship? Are you unlawfully present in the United States? Those questions have created a dragnet that has allowed us to stop more than 3 million people from getting weapons who shouldn't have them. But there are these big gaping loopholes out there that they can go on the internet and get one, or they can go to the parking lot of a convenience store in a private sale and get one, or they can go to a gun show and negotiate a private sale and get one without having to answer those questions. Well, the American people have spoken on this. That's really why this is the first legislation advocating gun safety to hit the floor of the House of Representatives in a quarter of a century. This is a great day for the gun safety movement that has overtaken America, rejecting the unconscionable toll of 100 people dead every single day in communities across the land. With that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Thompson, the sponsor of the underlying bill, H.R. 8, who's done such a magnificent job advocating this cause through thick and thin.
I thank the gentleman
from California.
For 2 minutes. I will yield for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman
from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this rule and for the underlying legislation, a bipartisan measure that will make all of our communities safer and will save lives. I'd like to thank Chairman McGovern for his fair consideration of H.R. 8 and the proposed amendments that came before the Rules Committee. This is an important time in our nation's history. Over 80% of Americans have come together to support universal background checks. This is a new day, and this is a time to act now. Since the tragedy in Newtown about 6.5 years ago, this House has held 54 moments of silence, but we have not held one moment of action. With Speaker Pelosi's leadership, we now have a chance to vote for two bipartisan bills which will help save lives. As a gun owner and a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, I was proud to introduce H.R. 8 with my bipartisan colleagues. I look forward to its consideration tomorrow, and I urge my colleagues to support this rule today and the bill tomorrow, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields the balance of his time. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 5 minutes to my good friend, the representative from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to voice my strong opposition to H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112. We all share the same goal to end gun violence. But in the course of this debate, House Democrats say they want to do something to end gun violence, and anyone who disagrees with their policies doesn't care. I believe in my heart that the gentleman from Maryland and the folks on the other side of this debate care about the victims of gun violence and the children in this country. And I know in my heart that my colleagues on this side of the aisle and I care too. It's a shame that in their rush to do something, anything, Democrats have made this a partisan show. They won't even allow my bipartisan concealed carry reciprocity bill that passed this House last Congress to be debated on the House floor today. What about the single mother victim of assault, like Shaneen Allen? Does she not have the right to defend herself? Instead of working on common sense solutions that can actually help prevent tragedies, like supporting local law enforcement, ensuring laws and protocols are followed, improving mental health, and implementing my concealed carry reciprocity, they're targeting law-abiding citizens. And they're disregarding existing federal law. There is no gun show loophole. Federal law already requires a background check on every commercial gun purchase in America, no matter where it takes place. Federal law already prohibits so-called straw purchases. Let's make one thing clear. H.R. 8 would not have stopped Newtown. H.R. 8 would not have stopped Parkland. It would not have stopped Las Vegas or Sutherland Springs or San Bernardino or the tragic attack on our former colleague, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. But the proponents of gun control don't want you to judge them based on outcomes. They want you to judge them based on intentions. And they say anyone who points out the facts, anyone who dares observe the obvious flaws in their legislation, do so because they don't care. In their rush to do something, House Democrats ignore that House Republicans have done many things, like strengthening the background check system, which would have prevented Sutherland Springs, improving mental health care, which would have prevented many of these shootings, such as Newtown and Charleston and Parkland, and giving schools the tools they need to protect students. All these bills received bipartisan support in the last Congress, but we don't get credit for real action because they say our intentions weren't good enough. We owe it to the American people to look past the intention and the emotion and focus like a laser on outcomes. What can we do to actually end gun violence once and for all? So what is this bill actually going to do? It's going to turn a law-abiding American into a criminal when you loan your shotgun to your buddy to go dove hunting. It's going to make it illegal for a victim of stalking to borrow a gun from a neighbor for protection. It's going to make the cost of a background check so expensive that the average American can't afford to buy a gun. Meanwhile, criminals are going to continue to get their firearms, whether it's through theft or the black market or on the street. I applaud President Donald Trump for standing with us against this ineffective legislation, and I encourage my colleagues to vote no. The American people want us to work together to solve this problem and stop gun violence. Can't we come together in a bipartisan way and not just do something, but do something that will actually make a difference? I'm calling on my colleagues to put partisanship aside, work together on ideas that will actually make a difference. I stand ready to continue this work. I'll work with anyone to end gun violence while also protecting the rights of law-abiding citizens, and I reject the false dilemma that we can't do both. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is now recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I suppose that we are in a rush to do anything, something, anything that works in order to curb the terrible toll of gun violence in our society. Oh, in the last Congress, it's true, there was other legislation that was brought to us. One was a proposal to legalize silencers in America, which sounds to me more like an agenda of organized crime than it is of the U.S. Congress trying to seek public safety. But there was this bipartisan Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which was a massive assault on federalism and states' rights. It would have destroyed every state's concealed carry law in the country to level it at the lowest common denominator. So if you could get a license to carry a concealed loaded weapon in one state, and in some states there are more than 1 million people who've been able to get them through completely permissive and lax laws, then you could go anywhere in the country. That's their proposal. That's what's coming out of the loophole factory. I just would like to assure my friend that we have a provision in our legislation, if you read it carefully, which says that you can temporarily transfer a gun at a shooting range, at a shooting gallery, or for purposes of hunting. So you don't have to worry about this. Our friends are either not reading carefully enough or they're overlooking very clear passages in our legislation which deal with common sense concerns. This is bipartisan legislation. It is backed by more than 90% of the American people, and it's going to advance common safety. So rather than searching for mysterious reasons to oppose it, why shouldn't everybody get together to say this is something that will promote the public safety? With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank Mr. Raskin of the Rules Committee for yielding the time. I rise in strong support of this rule in H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. Proud to be a co-sponsor, and I thank Congressman Thompson for his leadership. Our bill is intended to ensure that individuals who are prohibited from owning a firearm are not able to possess one. Rep. Raskin is right. America is in the midst of a gun violence emergency. Each year, 120,000 Americans are injured by firearm. 35,000 Americans die, and of those, 17,000 who are injured and killed are children. No other country in the world suffers the ravages of gun violence, and I'm afraid we've become numb to it. But we don't have to accept it, and we're not, because we're going to finally pass legislation here today. Mass shootings are on the rise. Military-style assault weapons are deadlier than ever. People are being gunned down in churches, schools, movie theaters, nightclubs, and synagogues. For so many years, the Republican-led Congress blocked action on common-sense gun safety laws. But finally, to the American people, we heard you. To the students who marched for their lives, we're finally going to act. It's time now. I urge adoption of this bipartisan bill, the rule. It's a vote for the safety of our communities and our families.
Gentlewoman yields the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to address a couple things that were said previously. I had sponsored an amendment as a survivor of domestic violence to allow victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse who have orders of protection to be able to get transferred a gun if, you know, they might be in fear of their life. And as I've said, often victims of domestic violence don't have the financial means, or they're so restricted by their perpetrator that it's difficult for them to go out and purchase a gun, let alone get a background check, and so they might have a friend that they can borrow it from. Now, in response, I think Mr. Raskin, if I'm not mistaken, said that the Democrats did help domestic violence victims, and you know, I just don't think that their amendment cuts it. And I'm going to read the amendment, if this is the one that you're talking about, Mr. Raskin. It says, a temporary transfer that is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm, if the possession by the transferee lasts only as long as immediately necessary to prevent the imminent death or great bodily harm, and then here's the amendment, including the harm of domestic violence, dating partner violence, sexual assault, stalking, and domestic abuse. And I would say just because you add the words domestic violence, domestic victims of domestic abuse, doesn't mean this is going to help. And the reason is simply because of what I've said before, is that these terms in here are really unclear, and I really would like somebody to explain. They're not defined anywhere. Who determines prevent imminent death or great bodily harm? And so let's say I am a victim of domestic violence, and I think, you know, my perpetrator is going to kill me. Does imminent death, and in this word, say lasts only as long as immediately necessary to prevent the imminent death? So does that mean the person that my friend who can lend me a gun, and, you know, has to be right there in the same room and see that there's imminent death coming? I mean, there is no definition here. And so it's unclear to me that this would help at all. Also, what is the definition of temporary transfer? How long is that? How long is temporary transfer? Does that mean, you know, just enough time you can throw somebody a gun while they're imminently in death? I mean, you have to be right there. What does this mean? There's no definition. So if we're going to proceed with this, I think that we should at least define what these terms mean. And therefore, I really wish that my amendment that said that victims of domestic violence or sexual abuse that have an order of protection through the court, would be allowed to at least borrow a gun to defend themselves from maybe a friend. And so with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I want to thank my colleague for advancing our discussion here, because I think now we're really starting to get somewhere. The gentlewoman suggested an amendment which allows for the transfer of a firearm to a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault who has an order of protection issued by a court. That's an extremely narrow exception. Most women who are enduring domestic violence don't have a civil protection order. Part of that is because of the incompetence of the laws in a lot of states, and part of it is because they haven't had the wherewithal to go get one. But our legislation and our amendment sweeps much more broadly. It allows any woman who is a victim of domestic violence, who faces a threat from their attacker, to be loaned a gun by a family member or be loaned a gun by a friend until the threat is resolved. But my friend suggests that there's something ambiguous about the words. I just don't see the ambiguity. Their original argument attacked the utility of all criminal law, saying we shouldn't have criminal laws essentially because criminals won't follow them. This seems like an attack on law itself. Law depends upon language, but the language is clear here, that if there's a threat, and if you're suffering from the threat of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so on, then you can get the gun. Who interprets it? Well, you've got the right to go out and get it. If someone were to prosecute you for doing that, the prosecution would clearly lose. So I'm afraid that our friends are looking for problems in this bipartisan legislation which simply don't exist. With that, I'm going to yield a minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, my friend Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I have to address the House for 1 minute. As a senior member on the Judiciary Committee and senior member on the Crime Committee, I too am glad of the underlying discussion regarding the protecting of women. But I rise today to support H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019, to close the gun show loopholes supported by 80% of the American people, so unlicensed dealers cannot undercover out of the back of their trunk, sell to people who would create and perpetrate either mass murders or individual abuse and gun violence. I also support H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, that would in fact have stopped the deaths at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where worshipers were shot down, 9 of them. To listen to the debate in the Judiciary Committee, 10 hours of rebuffing these simple legislative initiatives, I beg of my colleagues to stand with us. It is clear that we have an amendment, Horn and Murphy, that clarifies great bodily harm, includes domestic violence, dating partner violence, sexual assault, stalking, and domestic abuse. We want women to be protected and others involved in domestic abuse circumstances. My amendment that will be brought up as well will provide the information as to how many times the FBI have had to deal with petitions that have been denied. Let us not have another 20 years before we have bills that deal with gun safety legislation. Let's do it now. I yield back.
Gentlewoman, time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to refute some of the things or talk about some of the things said by my friends on the other side. One of the things that I do want to talk about is that Mr. Rascom said that my amendment is such a narrow exception for domestic violence victims, but yet I had a broader one in Judiciary Committee, if you remember, and the Chairman Nadler told me it was too broad, that I had to, it was too vague, and so that's why I made it very specific. If you'd like, I'd make it broad again. And also, in the Rules Committee, there was another amendment as well, and we're both on rules too, of course. And there was a broader one that said from Mr. Scalise, who is a victim of gun violence. He had an amendment that was ruled out of order, and that basically said that any victim of domestic violence, which was broad, but then he had another subsection that said victim of domestic violence or sexual abuse that has order of protection. So we covered both, yet it was ruled out of order. So we really tried. Now, the other thing that you brought up, that it's very clear what imminent danger means, and that would cover somebody, and surely, a domestic violence victim would not become a criminal under this law. Well, I don't think it's very sure. And so I asked Mr. Raskin, my colleague, if he would be open to removing the word imminent and just say danger instead of imminent danger, because to me, imminent danger means you have to be right in the same room, and throw somebody a gun or something. I mean, to me, the word imminent needs to be removed from the language. The other thing I'd like to talk about is that a number of times now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said, oh, so many people support this universal background check. Well, I disagree. I disagree because there's proof right in Maine. They had a ballot measure, and it was rejected by the majority of the people. So I just don't think, I suppose it depends on how you ask the question, but I just don't think that when you get into the details of how it takes away our fundamental Second Amendment rights and actually burdens law-abiding citizens and actually may harm people, some of these laws, like was the case with a young woman who testified in judiciary who said that good-intentioned gun laws actually prevented her from defending herself and she got raped. So I would say that there are some, in my disagreements with some of your statements. I also want to point out that there are many things that we can do on a bipartisan basis. And this obviously is not bipartisan, but I am the co-chairwoman of the Women's Caucus in Congress, and I have talked to my counterpart, who's a very nice woman and congresswoman, and we really do want to work on bipartisan solutions to gun violence. And I would say one of those is let's really concentrate on mental health issues. Now, we have done some things in the past. We did a Fix NICS Act, which we passed last year on a bipartisan basis, which really is an attempt to fix the national background system so that local jurisdictions actually report when there's problems, which I think is very valuable. We also did legislation in a bipartisan manner that would protect our schools more. And here's another thing we could do in a bipartisan manner. As you've noted, there was 3.5 million people have been stopped by NICS since 1994 from getting guns, and there was 112,000 were stopped just last year. But you know what? Only 12 of those 112,000 were actually prosecuted. Why? I mean, we have laws on the books now, we're not even enforcing them. So I think that's another thing we can do on a bipartisan basis. And again, this bill, I believe, does more harm than good. And I do think my colleagues are well-intentioned. I do believe that all of us, whether we're Republican or Democrat, want to reduce gun violence. And I reserve the rest of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. First, to clarify one thing, this is bipartisan legislation. We have at least 5 Republicans who are co-sponsoring and supporting this legislation, and I assume my friend doesn't need to read those 5 Republican members of the House of Representatives out of her caucus. I'm not quite sure what happened in Maine, but I know that there are around a dozen states in the District of Columbia which have already gotten rid of the loopholes that we're going to get rid of today in this federal legislation. My friend also invokes Second Amendment rights. I thought that we had put that red herring to rest in 2008 in Heller versus the District of Columbia. Justice Scalia said that reasonable regulation to screen out felons and fugitives and the mentally unstable is perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment. So everybody on both sides of the aisle favors the Second Amendment along with the rest of the Bill of Rights. So you've got to, if you're going to oppose this legislation, you've got to base it on some public safety rationale and not pretend like anybody's made a constitutional argument, because nobody has made a constitutional argument. Finally, on the question of the domestic violence amendment, I would invite my friend to come on over, and we would gladly have unanimous consent to have her added to the amendment, which is the broader amendment she's talking about. Of course, her amendment was the narrow one, which required you to have a civil protection order before there would be an exception from the provisions of the legislation. She said she was misdirected by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. All I can say is the legislative process is a treacherous place and a rocky road, especially for people in the minority. I've been dealing with that for several years. But in any event, we would love to have you join the amendment now. Mr. Speaker, I would make that offer to my friend. In the meantime, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, who is the great and distinguished chairman of the Committee on Rules. Mr. McGovern.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for yielding me the time. And I want to thank him for his leadership on this important issue. And let me remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are opposing this legislation that people are watching this debate. And I know many are scratching their heads, wondering what's going on, because what we're trying to do here is close loopholes that allow violent criminals to get access to guns, not create more loopholes. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday I spoke at a town hall sponsored by students at Bancroft High School in Worcester, Massachusetts. Those young people demanded action on gun violence, not unlike other young people all across my district and all across this country. They are terrified, and they are tired of seeing one massacre after another, after another, after another, and they're sickened by the unacceptable high rate of gun violence in this country. We have an obligation to be on their side, not on the side of the gun lobby. In fact, most gun owners agree with what we're doing here today. 97% of gun-owning households support universal background checks. 97%. You just don't see that support. You don't see support like that on very many things. But on this issue, the public is speaking loud and clear. The question is whether Congress is going to listen. Now, my office has been flooded with calls on this year after year after year. And I've heard from loved ones of victims killed and from those injured. I know many of my colleagues can say the same thing. It's heartbreaking. And each of us is in a unique position. We can do more than just listen. We can act. We can actually vote to help save lives. Now, sadly, past majorities have turned a deaf ear. In fact, it has been nearly a decade since the Judiciary Committee held a hearing on a major bill to combat gun violence. When they were in charge, my Republican friends on the other side held a hearing instead on a bill that would have actually brought more guns from out of state into local communities. Their indifference on this issue of gun violence, their silence, has been stunning. But this majority is not satisfied with inaction. We will not be cowed by the gun lobby. We are moving legislation in the case of H.R. 8 that has been in the works for more than 20 years. The time for inaction is over. Listen to the young people in your districts. They are not content with a future where gun violence is the norm. They want and they deserve better. You know, last night in the Rules Committee, my Republican friends tried to pass exception after exception after exception. May I ask them for another 30 seconds?
Gentleman is granted 30 seconds more.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
They try to pass exception after exception to this universal background check bill, essentially trying to gut the bill. Well, this is a modest reform in the right direction. We are trying to save lives. We are tired of massacres. We are tired of comforting parents whose loved ones were killed in gun violence. We are tired of inaction. We are tired of the gun lobby dictating what Congress does and doesn't pass. This majority is going to be run by the people of this country, and the majority of the people of this country overwhelmingly support these bills. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote for this rule and vote for the underlying legislation.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Raskin, for yielding for your tireless leadership. I rise today in strong support of the rule and H.R. 8, Congressman Thompson's bipartisan bill, which makes gun sale background checks universal. Now, this bill is an important step to ensure that individuals who should not be allowed to purchase a gun are no longer able to purchase a gun. Since 2014, nearly 400 of my constituents have died by gun violence. Our community feels their loss every single day. Here are just a few of their names and tragic stories. Davon Ellis. Davon was a star football player and an excellent student at Oakland Tech High School. He was shot and killed while walking home from school. My nephew was walking with him when he was gunned down. Trayvon Godfrey. Trayvon was killed in 2016 while sitting in a car with his friends in front of his home. Every time I think about Trayvon, my heart breaks. Trayvon came to a town meeting that I held on gun violence in January of 2016. Sadly, these heartbreaking stories are all too familiar in communities across the country. More than 30,000 Americans lose their lives to gun violence each year. Shootings now kill as many Americans as car accidents. And that's why this bill is so important. It's a good, may I have 30 additional seconds?
Yes, indeed. I will yield 30 additional seconds.
Additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. This bill is a good first step to ensure that our background checks are strengthened and that we keep guns out of the wrong hands and that we close these loopholes. Mr. Speaker, we must end this epidemic of gun violence in our country. This is a national emergency. This bill will save lives. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule and yes on the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I will be prepared to close, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. If we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to make my amendment in order, which would allow domestic violence and sexual assault victims with orders of protection to be exempt from the gun transfer prohibitions. This amendment is crucial to saving lives. As a survivor of domestic violence, I know what it's like to be in fear for our lives. This common sense amendment is clear-cut. If you are a victim with an order of protection, you can borrow a firearm or transfer a firearm to you. It's important because victims don't often have the means to purchase or go pay for a background check. The Democrats have presented a letter from the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence as a reason for not needing my amendment. However, with all due respect, the National Task Force does not speak for every victim, and they certainly do not speak for me. In fact, they never even contacted me, and I have been an outspoken person saying I'm a survivor of domestic violence since I ran for Congress. And I am also the person that sponsored the amendment to extend the Violence Against Women Act, yet they have never talked to me or reached out to my office. The majority offered a political amendment on domestic violence, which I've already talked about, which really does not do any good because the definitions of imminent danger are not defined and will not be carried out and will not be effective. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with the extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, we all want to solve gun violence in the United States, but H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 will not solve the problem. As co-chairwoman of the Bipartisan Women's Caucus, I am committed to working across the aisle on solutions we can all agree on. However, this is not one of them. We can talk about mental health. We can talk about strengthening the NICS background check system even more. We can talk about enforcing the laws that are already on the books. H.R. 8 will turn law-abiding citizens into criminals by making everyday gun transfers a crime and putting those that seek to protect themselves in jail for wanting to do so. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 will place an undue burden on citizens who already have a background check. For instance, security clearance, global entry, state-issued permits, etc. These pieces of legislation put law-abiding citizens in danger by disarming them and emboldening criminals. The bad guys never follow the laws. And in fact, I believe that this legislation violates the Second Amendment of the Constitution because it does not prohibit undue fees for this background checks, and thus someone could not afford them and thus not be able to get a gun to defend themselves. Mr. Speaker, I urge no on the previous question, no on the underlying measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Far from trying to turn law-abiding citizens into criminals, our legislation will save law-abiding citizens from criminals simply by expanding the successful Brady Law, which has been in effect for decades now. The gentlewoman introduces a constitutional argument at the last minute here saying that our legislation is unconstitutional because there may be undue fees imposed. Of course, those are the fees that are currently imposed under the Brady Law, so I'm afraid that my friend has just made an argument for the unconstitutionality of the current law, which has saved us from more than 3 million felons, fugitives, mentally unstable people, drug abusers, and undocumented aliens from acquiring firearms in the country. Mr. Speaker, our country is a social contract. I know we got a lot of young people here today. We're a social contract, and if you go back and read any of the social contract theorists, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, any of them say we leave a state of nature, which is a state of war, which is a state of war and a state of violence, in order to live in a civilized way. But how civilized is it when tens of thousands of Americans every year are being killed in firearm violence? Every day, 100 Americans, another 100 Americans are killed with guns. In 2017, the highest level in 40 years, we saw nearly 40,000 Americans died from gun violence. That's not a civilized state. That's a state of war. That's a state of violence. And so we know what the loopholes are, and we're going to close the loopholes with this legislation, with our bipartisan legislation, which has support from Republicans. It has support from Democrats. The public opinion polls show that more than 95% of the American people support what we're trying to do here. Close the gun show loophole. Close the private sale loophole. Close the internet loophole. Make sure that everybody who purchases a gun in America is purchasing it only with the universal comprehensive mental and criminal background check. And we have amendments for the discrete exceptions that are necessary, including in cases of imminent violence, including rape and sexual assault by domestic violence. We think that this legislation is excellent legislation that every member of Congress should feel proud in voting for. And with that, we submit to you both H.R. 8, the bipartisan background check act, as well as the bill to close the Charleston loophole so that criminals are not given guns after 3 days. We're able to delay that process in the event that more investigation is needed. And with that, I would yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Speaker, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman yields back his time. All time has expired, and the previous question's been moved. The question is on the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I call
Gentleman
for.
from Arizona.
I ask for the yeas and nays to be counted.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having arisen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by a 5-minute vote on adoption of the resolution 145. If ordered. And in addition, ordering the previous question on Resolution 144 and adoption of House Resolution 144, if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 229, the nays are 191. The previous question is ordered. The question's on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I call for the ayes and nays.
The ayes and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the ayes and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. These are 200.
Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 227. The nays are 194. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 144, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Calendar Number 9, House Resolution 144, resolution providing for consideration of the joint resolution, House Joint Resolution 46, relating to a national emergency declared by the President on February 15, 2019.
The question is on ordering the previous question. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. vote. The yeas are 228. The nays are 193. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
On that, I'd ask the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 229, the nays are 193. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair lays before the House the communications.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives, Madam, due to a clerical error outside of our office, I have been mistakenly added to the House Veterans Affairs Committee roster. I am submitting this statement to remedy this error. I hereby resign from the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Signed sincerely, Andy Levin.
Without objection, the resignation is accepted. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Democratic Caucus, I offer a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 148, resolved that the following named members be and are hereby elected to the following standing committees of the House of Representatives.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be considered as read and printed in the record.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives, Madam, under Clause 2G of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, I herewith designate Ms. Gloria Lett, Deputy Clerk, Mr. Robert Reeves, Deputy Clerk, and Lloyd Horwich, Legal Counsel, to sign any and all papers and do all other acts for me under the name of the Clerk of the House, which they would be authorized to do by virtue of this designation, except such as are provided by statute in the case of my temporary absence or disability. This designation shall remain in effect for the 116th Congress or until modified by me. Signed sincerely, Cheryl L. Johnson, Clerk of the House.
The House will come to order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Resolution 144, I call up H.J. Res. 46 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 46, a joint resolution relating to a national emergency declared by the President on February 15, 2019.
Pursuant to House Resolution 144, the joint resolution is considered read. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves, will each control 30 minutes of time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members...
The House will come to order. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on H.J. Res. 46.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. President Trump's decision to declare a national emergency at the southern border to siphon funds for his border wall is an unconstitutional, grotesque abuse of power. An emergency declaration is not a last-ditch maneuver to employ when all negotiation attempts have failed. The House of Representatives has rejected the president's border wall, the Senate has rejected the border wall, and the American people have rejected this useless wall. The president does not get to override Congress in a raucous temper tantrum over his inability to broker a deal. The National Emergencies Act was enacted in 1976 to expedite the allocation of resources for real emergencies to save American lives and mitigate damage caused by natural disasters and acts of terror. It was not fashioned to allow a president to deny the will of Congress and the American people. Both Democrats and Republicans alike should be very concerned about the ramifications of this unprecedented executive action. It is a direct threat to the balance of power that our country was built upon and a violation of our nation's Constitution. There is also no factual basis for the emergency declaration. Immigration from the southern border has significantly decreased in the last 10 years. Any attempts to characterize the border as a crisis zone are flagrant abuses of statistics, which have shown that border crossings are at the lowest they've been in 40 years. President Trump has long proved he is not married to the truth or facts, and he has no proof to substantiate his wild claims about the status of the United States and the Mexican border. We cannot abandon our commitment to responsible governing and the truth because President Trump is outraged at his inability to fulfill a campaign promise. There is wide bipartisan support for this measure, and our democracy demands that we condemn this subversion of our Constitution and this misuse of presidential power. And with that, I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves his time. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities concerning the president. Gentleman from Georgia. Missouri, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the President clearly laid out the case for a declaration of a national emergency in his State of the Union address right here. National security is obviously the President's highest priority, and I support his efforts to build a wall. There is a crisis at the border that could have been addressed much sooner and prevented. Open border policies of the last administration compounded this growing problem. We've got schools, hospitals, and other services that have become overcrowded. American workers have been hurt by reduced job opportunities and lower wages. And at the same time, human and drug trafficking has thrived. In many communities, the notorious MS-13 gang has grown. We've seen tragic cases of crimes committed by illegal aliens who have been deported not once, not even twice, but multiple times. I want to cite just one example in my home state of Missouri. A man named Pablo Serrano Vitorino was deported to Mexico after a felony conviction in 2003. He later returned to this country illegally and was arrested again in 2014 and in 2015 after several more violent incidents, and he remained in the U.S. Then in 2016, this individual who had no right to be in this country was charged for murdering 5 people in Kansas City, Kansas, and Montgomery County, Missouri. Stories like this aren't unique to Missouri, Mr. Speaker. These horrifying events are happening across this country. This is a crisis. The men and women who put their lives on the line every day to bring order and security to our borders, they deserve the tools that they need to do the job. And now this president is taking decisive action to finally address the crisis using the authority provided to him by the Congress. The National Emergencies Act is very clear. The provisions the president will use under Title 10 explicitly provide the president with the clear authority. I support the president's efforts. I believe he is well within the law in making this declaration, and I'd urge my colleagues to oppose Joint Resolution 46. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, 2.5 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Speaker. About 6 weeks ago, when the rumors began that the president might declare a national emergency to build his border wall, my staff and I began working with Legislative Counsel to make sure that Congress would have a say in what amounts to constitutional cannibalism by the president. This is the most consequential vote we will take in a generation on the balance of powers between the legislative and the executive branches of government. Whether we will respect the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution, stand up for Congress and for this country and for the Constitution, or whether we will stand down in favor of the president. The precedent that may be set today this week or next week when the Senate votes, if Congress allows this president's emergency declaration to stand, will not have ramifications only on this matter or the building of a border wall, but if the president is successful, he will likely come back for more. He will likely circumvent Congress again in the same unconstitutional way. Not only will this president do it, future presidents will do it. And I ask you this, how are we to tell a future president, if this president is successful, that gun deaths, which number in the tens of thousands, are not a national emergency? That opioid deaths are not a national emergency? That climate change is not a national emergency? This will allow a president to sideline Congress for much of domestic policy. And bear in mind, Congress over the years has already, on its own, I believe, given up a lot of its authority with respect to foreign policy. It's also clear that there is no emergency at the border. Border crossings are at a 4 decades low. The folks who are coming today are presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents seeking asylum, not trying to get around the border. There are more law enforcement officers at our border, federal, state, and local officers, than at any time in our nation's history. Since its founding, this country has become the most powerful and prosperous on the face of the earth without a border wall. That's why most Americans disagree with the president usurping the power of Congress to build his border wall. In fact, not only do they disagree with that, they disagree with using military construction money on this border project. Cities like mine in San Antonio stand to lose millions of dollars in military construction. I urge my colleagues to vote for this resolution.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. Congress explicitly authorized the President to undertake certain military construction projects that are not otherwise authorized by law when it passed the National Security Act. The President is working within the legal boundaries that the Congress gave him. With that, I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Now it's for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman from Missouri is exactly right. It is the statutes that allow this president to do this. The statutes don't provide for national emergencies on climate change. They don't allow for national emergencies on gun violence. But they do allow it in terms of this particular issue, and the president is exactly right. There is a crisis at the border, Mr. Speaker, but not only this president recognizes it, the previous President Obama in 2014 did as well when he requested $3.7 billion in emergency spending to secure the border. Where was the outrage then? Where was the outrage from my colleagues across the aisle? President Obama even went on further to say that we needed to make sure that we needed to secure our border to deter both adults and children from the dangerous journey that they embarked on. Where was the outrage across the aisle then, Mr. Speaker? It was not there. Keeping criminals out, human trafficking and drug smugglers away from our communities is paramount. Yes, indeed, we do have an opioid problem. We've actually appropriated billions of dollars to address that, and yet somehow the drugs flowing across our southern border are not a crisis. You know, again, President Obama seemed to agree with this and declared a national emergency for transnational criminal organizations, specifically calling out Mexico's Los Zetas gang, and provided more authority for ICE to actually combat that. A national emergency. Where was the outrage across the aisle then? But we don't even have to look just at the previous administration. President Clinton also declared a national emergency to go after narcotics traffickers. Mr. Speaker, I just find it just unbelievable that here today that we have got these newfound constitutionalists across the aisle wanting to rein in the president's authority. This is about defeating President Trump. I encourage a no vote on this resolution, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American people should know that there's not any statutes that would allow a president to declare an emergency to build a border wall. Not one piece of legislation would allow that. Previous presidents have declared emergencies, but they have never ventured into the legislative prerogative to allocate funding, and that's the difference that we have here. Mr. Speaker, I want to yield to the gentleman from New York and also the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler, 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, President Trump's declaration of a national emergency as an excuse to build a wall that Congress explicitly rejected is an abuse of his constitutional oath and cannot be tolerated by a co-equal branch of government under the Constitution. We must reject this unlawful power grab and reassert Congress' authority to exercise the power of the purse. The Constitution could not be clearer. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. That command reflects a fundamental principle that is older than our democracy itself. The chief executive cannot unilaterally spend taxpayers' money or redirect the budget set by the people's representatives. Earlier this year, Congress reached a bipartisan compromise to fund the government. It was signed by the President. Congress allocated limited funding for fencing in certain areas, but squarely rejected the President's request to build a medieval barrier across the southern border. Almost immediately, the President decided to rewrite the budget set by Congress, and he told us exactly why. He was not satisfied with what he got from the process that the Constitution dictates, so he did an end run and made an emergency. He and his aides have barely even tried to pretend that the so-called emergency is a real one. They know that illegal immigration is at historically low levels. They know that children and families fleeing violence are coming here to make lawful asylum claims, not as some kind of invading army. They know that illegal drugs overwhelmingly get smuggled through ports of entry, that a wall would do nothing to change that. But they refuse to let the facts and the law stand in the way of their political agenda. Even worse, the emergency law that President Trump invoked allows the military to redirect funds only if an emergency requires use of the armed forces, and those funds can be used only for construction projects that are necessary to support such use of the armed forces. But a wall cannot be possibly necessary to support a military operation on the border because our laws prohibit the military from engaging in law enforcement activities. The military cannot enforce an immigration law, so the President's actions are doubly unlawful. There is no real emergency, and even if there were, the President could not redirect military funds for a purpose expressly prohibited to the military. Fortunately, the Constitution does not get suspended based on President Trump's preferences about what is convenient or faster. Our nation's founders left it up to all of us, including those of us in Congress, to act as guardians against exactly this type of assault on our constitutional order. In that spirit, I proudly support this joint resolution, and I call upon my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand up and do the same. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I'd yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, on the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On February 15th, the President exercised his clear authority under a clear federal statute duly enacted by Congress to use funds already appropriated by Congress for the purpose of securing our southern border. Mr. Speaker, I am glad about one thing today coming here. I am glad that for many years, the years I've been here, I've came here through the Rules Committee and others and talked about Article 1 authority. I am glad now to see that we have others who have now figured out that Article 1 probably needs to be enforced. What is interesting is selective enforcement against a president they don't like, for a purpose they don't want, for a wall that they don't want to have, because securing the border is not the top agenda for them. I get it if you don't like it, but argue with the law. The statute itself and the president's actions in accordance with it rest solidly within the separation of powers and are certainly constitutional. If you're citing the Supreme Court case of Youngstown against the president's actions today during this debate, then I suggest you haven't read the case. That reasoning of Youngstown case only applies when the president is acting unilaterally and not pursuant to a duly elected statute by Congress. Maybe the selective memory here is because the previous president actually did that when he instituted the DACA program under no things that he could have found to actually work on. Then we discussed the issue of, is there an actual emergency on the border? You know, a president once noted, he said, we've seen significant rise in apprehensions and processing of children and individuals in Central America who are crossing into the United States Rio Grande Valley areas of the southwest border. The individuals who embark upon this journey are subject to violent crime, abuse, extortion, as they rely on dangerous human smuggling networks to transport them from Central America to Mexico. Most may think that was from the current president. It was not. It was from President Obama when he was requesting more money for the emergency on the border. The problem is the factual basis is there. We sat in a hearing today in the Judiciary Committee, and I had to look at the faces of our Border Patrol agents and ICE agents and others dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, while all they get many times from this body is hate and derision when they're doing their job that we sent them to do. My problem comes back here. If we can argue about different things, this was under the law and done by Republicans and Democrats for the last almost 40 years. If you want to fix this, then you've done what you should do under law. You brought your resolution of disapproval. But if you really wanted to take Article I authority, then actually look at the law itself. Actually want to change it. That's what this body ought to be doing. If you don't like the fact that the president can do something, and especially my friends across the aisle who don't want this president to do anything, then fix the law. Go into this emergency declaration and say, we'll define what a national emergency is. We'll do that. They don't want to do that because they don't want to bind the hands, because they know that the law was written for a purpose that has been upheld for over 40 years. This is simply a show. It's a farce. Let's just get to the political aspect of this and say, Mr. Speaker, we don't like the president. We don't like what he's doing. Oops, we forgot about this law. And the president said, I will act under the authority given to me by Congress. You can have all the arguments you want, but at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, when you cast this vote, don't hide behind Article I. Don't hide behind separation of powers. Go to the law and look at what the law says and vote no. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker. Can I inquire as to how much time is remaining?
The gentleman from Missouri has 22 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has 22.5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot of cries from the administration about there being a problem on the southern border with caravans loaded with people being human trafficked. And there's just simply unsubstantiated this is unsubstantiated and unfounded. There's no reports that this is happening. This is a figment of the imagination of some in the administration. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield 1 minute to the gentle lady from the Virgin Islands, Delegate Stacey Plaskett.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The President's emergency declaration is, in fact, a power grab to go outside the bounds of the law and get what he failed to achieve in constitutional legislative process. After failing to convince the American people in Congress to pay for his ineffective, wasteful, multi-billion-dollar concrete wall, the President is now trying a desperate end run around Congress with his unlawful emergency declaration. The President's declaring an emergency over a crisis that does not exist. The statute only applies to national emergencies that require use of the armed forces for military construction projects that are necessary to support the use of armed forces. The border wall is not a military construction project. It does not require the use of the military. The immigration law is the responsibility of the federal immigration enforcement agencies, not the military. The President's declaration violates federal law, and that is the crisis. This is a crisis, a crime against our Constitution. It is an assault. It is a rape, what the President is doing now, against the Constitution, against this legislative body. I am just in another world that I, as a constitutional strict constructionist, am on this side of the aisle on an issue like this. I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I might remind my colleagues that Title 10, Section 2808 explicitly authorizes the President to change the appropriation for military construction. He is operating within the law. Right now, I would go ahead and yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, who's also the ranking Republican on Homeland Security.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Missouri. Without a doubt, there is a crisis at the border. Changing demographics have created unprecedented challenges for the Border Patrol. In the early 2000s, most illegal border crossers were young Mexican men. Today, and our laws allowed us to quickly return them back to Mexico. But today, that flow of Mexican men has been replaced with a mix of men, women, and children from Central American countries. Human traffickers are exploiting the loopholes in our laws and understand how our immigration system is broken. These smugglers tell vulnerable families that their child is like a visa to stay in the U.S. if they can just get themselves turned in to the Border Patrol. And these smugglers and their propaganda are effective. Family apprehensions for fiscal year 2019 are already 572% higher than fiscal 2013. And these traffickers don't care about the people they smuggle. The result is that immigrants of all ages are arriving on our doorstep in terrible health. Border Patrol projects a 133% increase over last year in migrants needing medical treatment after crossing the border. These changing migrant flows force our law enforcement officers to act as paramedics rather than enforcing the laws that Congress has passed. We need an all-of-the-above approach to border security, and that includes manpower, 21st century technology, and barriers. With this approach, we will deter human smugglers and others crossing hundreds of miles of open desert with innocent children. We know this approach works. In areas where we have built a wall system, such as Yuma, illegal traffic has plummeted by 95%. Let's build on this success. I encourage my colleagues to stand by President Trump's decision to use an executive authority to carry out this approach and keep America safe. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that the other side acknowledges that the people approaching our southern border are not men from Mexico, but they are families with children fleeing violence in Central America. That's an important distinction. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to my friend, the gentleman from the state of Maryland, Congressman Anthony Brown, also Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee. 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
There is no national emergency on our southern border. There are no terrorists who are being apprehended. There's no invading hostile force, and border crossings remaining at a 40-year low. Pulling resources from military construction projects, as President Trump would do, projects meant to improve readiness and support our service members, impacts our national security. It will hurt military families who are already dealing with military housing with mold and lead poisoning and outdated schools and medical facilities. This declaration of national emergency will keep thousands of active duty troops needlessly deployed at the southern border and away from their scheduled training activities and operational readiness. This is a fake emergency. And for President Trump to claim we need to build a wall to support our armed forces, it's absurd and ridiculous. This emergency declaration is just an overreaching and dangerous power grab to push forward the president's anti-immigrant agenda and supposedly boost his re-election chances. There's no national emergency, only a crisis in the Oval Office. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I might point out to my colleagues just how much of a national emergency this is. And it was President Obama who recognized this, recognized a crisis at the border. In 2014, President Obama requested $3.7 billion in emergency supplemental funding for what he described as a humanitarian crisis at the border. And he specifically cited an increase in family units trying to cross the border and the lack of resources to accommodate them. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Adderholt.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to oppose the joint resolution to overturn the President's declaration. I think it's very clear that there is a national emergency that exists on our southern border because of the high rate of unchecked, unregulated illegal immigration. Illegal immigration that has not directly contributed to the flow of drugs, human trafficking, and that is directly contributed to the flow of drugs, human trafficking, and gang members into this country. Not to mention the humanitarian crisis of those who feel compelled to make this journey to illegally enter this country. I think there seems to be some confusion among many of my colleagues and maybe across the country about the action of the President. President Trump is clearly acting within the authority that is provided by Congress to confront a border security and humanitarian crisis that constitutes a national emergency. The threat to our border security is evident from the sheer number of migrants seeking to gain illegal entry into this country, and especially the number of criminal aliens in the form of cartels, traffickers, and gangs. And these people will continue to take advantage of our weak borders for their own gain. I recognize that Congress has lawfully enacted the authority for the President to use military construction funds to support armed forces to engage in accordance with the National Emergency Act. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to oppose this joint resolution at the crisis, as a crisis at the border, that it's real, and that I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friends on the other side keep invoking the mantra, Obama, Obama, even though they opposed each and every initiative that he put forward, regardless of merit. Now they want to come back and cite him for what he said and what he did. But one thing he did not do was to allocate funding that he was not entitled to. He always requested from the Congress funding authority. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from New York, Adriano Espaillat, a time of 1 minute.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Less than 2 weeks ago, after another failed attempt to establish consensus on border security funding, President Trump, a self-proclaimed master negotiator, failed to get a border wall that he originally said Mexico would pay for. So then he fraudulently invoked a national emergency declaration to rob taxpayers of funds from other programs. The President's bracing decision not only violates Congress' constitutional powers of the purse laid out in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, it's also a fabricated emergency propped up by fake statistics, racist undertones, and the blatant hypocrisy of a party that had complete control of Washington for 2 years and didn't see it fit to fund this useless medieval war themselves. By diverting funds from the military projects, the President has determined that national security takes a backseat to his political priorities. Today in the Senate, the head of the U.S. Northern Command said that border crossings do not pose a military threat. Mr. Speaker, there is no emergency. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the ranking member. I rise in opposition to this resolution. When President Trump declared a national emergency, he did so in response to the ongoing humanitarian crisis at our border and with full statutory authority vested in laws passed in this very chamber. The majority claims that this resolution of disapproval is in response to a power grab by a president acting out of line. Yet by merely disapproving of the emergency declaration, they are preserving the statutory powers they claim are inappropriate. If my colleagues across the aisle are so concerned about separation of powers, why don't they simply reform the laws in Title 10 and Title 50 that the President is using to respond to this crisis? The answer is because this resolution is not about the division of powers. It's not even about border security. The only reason this legislation is being considered on the floor today is to obstruct the President's agenda. The President has made it clear that he will use all statutory tools at his disposal to secure the border, and that is exactly what he's doing in declaring this emergency. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri has 16 3/4 minutes. The gentleman from Georgia. has 18 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I will yield to the good gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Chuy Garcia. 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues make some very good points. They make convincing arguments about executive overreach and the misuse of federal funds. I thank them for those statements, and I would like to add and ask a more personal question. Since when do we call human beings in need national emergency? Have all of President Trump's other arguments failed? Is he running out of insults for people like me, people who came from Mexico to have a better life in this country? He used to call people like me bad hombres. When that failed, he turned to other insults, and after they lose its shock value, he calls us rapists, then murderers. At that point, he ran out of insults for people like me, so he referred to us as coyotes. And now, when all other labels have failed to achieve his central campaign promise to build a medieval border wall, he calls people like me a national emergency. We must reject this premise and the presence of people like me in this country, of people like my constituents in my district, a national emergency. I yield back my time.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities concerning the president. The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today because we must secure our border. We are in the midst of a national security and humanitarian crisis on our southern border, which must be addressed. Earlier this month, Congress secured important and necessary funding to protect over 55 miles of our most dangerous border, where it has been so desperately needed. We have also provided funding for over 600 new border officers. This was a good step in the right direction, but as we see again today, our colleagues from across the aisle remain unwilling to address our intensifying border crisis. With the national emergency